Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling cases in U.S. history. Today, we'll explore the shadows of the Appalachian Mountains, where a 1914 discovery rocked a community and raised issues that are still relevant today. Tell us where you're watching from, and whether you've heard about West Virginia's sinister mysteries in the comments section below. At that time, the mountains continued to conceal unbreakable secrets. In 1914, West Virginia was just beginning to embrace modernity, where dirt tracks served as roads, and most people were unaware of the luxury of electric light. Small towns on Appalachia's steep slopes were cut off from one another by deep valleys and thick forests that seemed to engulf anyone who ventured out on their own. Greenbrier County was well known for its small farms strewn throughout the hills and its coal mines. To survive, the local families relied on the land and one another. Winter arrived early and departed late, bringing with it a persistent fog that held on to the pines and transformed the area into something eerily spectral. Everyone knew one another. Secrets were difficult to keep, and when silence was needed, it could be deafening. A 23-year-old girl named Martha Pike lived on a secluded property close to the town of Rio with her family. Martha, a farmer's daughter, was well known for her quiet demeanor and her kind demeanor toward local kids. She looked after the chickens, assisted her mother with housework, and spent hours sewing by the window while admiring the mountains in the distance. She wore modest dresses sewn by her own mother, and her brown hair was always pulled back in a simple bun. No one in the family knew the man who started visiting Martha in the spring of 1914. He said he traveled through nearby counties as a tool dealer, tall, with dark eyes that hardly ever blinked, and a thick beard. The man always showed up at sunset, when the paths were being engulfed by the mountain shadows. Although Martha's parents disapproved of the visits, the young lady claimed that he was merely a friend who brought information from other areas. Martha informed her mother one May afternoon that she was going to town to get some cloth from Mr. Hutchinson's store. Following a narrow trail that meandered through oak trees and crossed a stream of icy water, the hike would take roughly 2 hours. Martha walked away wearing a blue shawl over her shoulders and a wicker basket on her arm. Martha Pike never came home, despite his assurance that she would return before dusk. The parents awaited the arrival of night, entirely. The father went out on the route his daughter would have taken with a kerosene lantern when darkness descended upon the mountains, and Martha had not yet returned. He repeatedly called his name, but only the echo, which came back from the slopes like a wail, answered. After the neighbors were informed the following morning, a group of 12 men assembled to search for the young lady. They searched the path, examined the stream's banks, and went into areas of the forest that few people had visited. There was nothing discovered, not both of thee, neither the shawl nor the basket, nor any indication that Martha had gone by. The days stretched into weeks. Everyone who had seen Martha in the days preceding her disappearance was questioned by the county sheriff, Walter Briggs, a middle-aged man. Additionally, the tool dealer who paid the young lady a visit vanished. Nobody knew where he had disappeared to. Some claimed to have witnessed him travel to Tennessee in the South. Few people dared to venture near the old, abandoned mines, but others vowed they had seen him there. Theories started to circulate in the community. Martha might have fled with the enigmatic man. Maybe he had lost his way in the woods and fallen victim to the mountain night's chill. Or maybe something much darker had occurred during that trip from his house to the city. A climate of distrust developed. The neighbors exchanged suspicious glances. Children were kept close to home even during the day, and women started to avoid going for walks by themselves. Only in the beginning of August, almost 3 months after the disappearance, did the truth start to surface from the depths of those old mountains. And no one was ready to confront the darkness that accompanied its appearance. But in the upcoming sections of this unsettling tale, We'll discover that together. Please hit like if you're enjoying it so that more people are aware of this case. And turn on the bell to ensure you don't miss any information about what's to come. Nobody could have foreseen how the discovery came to be. Thomas and Samuel Garrett, two hunting brothers, were pursuing deer tracks on August 5, 1914. The steep rise of Mount Sue's highest slopes, which were so densely covered in vegetation that sunlight could hardly reach the forest floor. Nobody knew those lands better than the Garretts. They were able to recognize every kind of footprint, every sound in the forest, and every warning sign because they had grown up hunting with their father. As they followed the trail that morning, they came across an oddity. The humid mountain air started to smell strongly of something acrid. Any seasoned hunter would recognize the scent right away. Acknowledge. The stench of death. After exchanging nervous looks, the brothers chose to follow that funeral trail despite all of their gut feelings telling them to turn around. About 300 meters from the main path, they discovered something that would forever alter the history of that area. Martha Pike's body, or what remained of it, was buried beneath a heap of rotting leaves and dry branches, half of which was covered by rocks that had obviously been placed there on purpose. The 3 months that are subject to the weather, wildlife, and summer, they had suffered from the heat of Appalachia. However, the Garrett brothers were deeply troubled by something that went beyond natural decay. There were unmistakable indications that Martha had not passed away naturally or accidentally. Thomas Garrett alerted the authorities by running down the mountain to Rio, the closest town. Sheriff Walter Briggs arrived at the scene of the discovery within hours, joined by 6 other men and a local physician named Henry Morton. Their worst fears were confirmed by what they saw there. They had taken Martha to that isolated location, which was picked specifically for its inaccessibility, where very few people would be able to locate her. There was no denying the attempt to hide the body. In the depths of those mountains, someone had put a lot of effort into making her vanish forever. Under the dense shade of pine trees, a preliminary analysis was carried out by Dr. Morton, a man who had worked as an army medic in past conflicts and had witnessed his fair share of horrors. His research was documented in a leather notebook that would subsequently be stored in county documents. Martha had been brutally abused. There were indications of skull trauma, including fractures that suggested powerful blows. His clothing, or what was left of it, was ripped and strewn all over his body. A few meters away, the blue shawl she had worn the day she vanished was discovered, deteriorated and stained, stuck in a bush. Like fire in dry straw, the news quickly spread throughout the community. Martha Pike was still alive. He was still on course. They had killed her, and whoever had done it was still in the area, possibly observing, possibly making plans to flee, or perhaps already too far away to be apprehended. What was already a fear became a panic. Even during the day, families kept their doors locked. Everywhere they went, men started carrying rifles, and they all asked the same question in a low voice. Martha had been harmed by whom? Sheriff Briggs lacked experience as a homicide investigator. In 1914, West Virginia lacked the forensic tools that still exist today. There were no labs where evidence could be examined. The crime scene was not photographed in great detail. No criminal databases existed. Testimonies, instinct, and a little bit of luck were all that were needed. Briggs started going over everything he had gathered over the course of the 3-month search. He resumed questioning people, but he kept coming back to the same person, the enigmatic merchant who had visited Martha and vanished at the same moment. However, nobody was aware of the true name of this individual. He had only identified himself as James. He had no known family in the area and had left no address. He was not listed in the local hotels or pensions books. It seemed like a ghost that had ascended in the mountains, carried out its sinister mission, and then vanished once more into the Appalachian mists. Some visitors were questioned while they were in the area. Weeks after Martha's death, a street vendor claimed to have seen a man who fit James's description close to the Kentucky border. Disappearance, but that was the end of the trail. Local newspapers started reporting on the case in the meantime. An entire story about Martha Pike's murder was published by the Greenbrier Independent, characterizing the young lady as a kind person who had fallen prey to unfathomable evil. The text urged state authorities to take action and demanded justice. The story was repeated by other newspapers in the neighboring counties, each of which added its own conjectures and theories. Southern states soon learned about Martha Pike's case. West Virginia. However, Sheriff Briggs encountered a wall of silence as the community demanded answers and the media conjectured. Something was missing from the conversation. He sensed it in the long pauses between responses, in the advertisements of his gaze, and in the lines of conversation. Someone had more information than they were prepared to share. And he was overcome by this certainty. The truth was waiting to be found, concealed in the mountain shadows, and soon an unexpected discovery would reveal information that many people would rather keep hidden forever. Stay tuned to learn what transpired in this sinister tale. The unexpected turnabout was unexpected. Sheriff Briggs was approached by an elderly woman named Abigail Thornton in his tiny office at the Real police station towards the end of August. Respected in the community as a midwife and healer, Abigail had assisted in the birth of half of the county's children. The weight of decades of kept secrets was evident in her tired eyes. Whispered confessions on her deathbed, things she had promised never to tell. However, something within her had been rocked by Martha Pike's passing. Holding a cup of tea that the sheriff had offered her with shaking hands, Abigail started to tell a story that would fundamentally alter the investigation's trajectory. She disclosed that approximately 1 month prior to her disappearance in April, Martha had requested her services. The young lady had a baby. I was scared, ashamed, and in need of direction. Abigail had attempted to soothe her, suggested that she tell her family, and offered her teas to improve her health. However, Martha pleaded for privacy. He claimed that there had been lies and broken promises, and that the child's father was a man who was unable to assume paternity. That realization weighed heavily on Sheriff Briggs. The enigmatic merchant wasn't merely courting Martha. Everything changed when she became pregnant with his child. A man who wanted to eliminate an awkward obligation, who wanted to. Evidence of a scandal would be sufficient justification to carry out the unimaginable. That murder was a crime of opportunity, but because of Martha's pregnancy, it was planned, calculated, and incredibly cowardly. Abigail disclosed more. Martha had told him that the man had a wife in another state, he said, that he frequently traveled between West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee, selling land on behalf of a business whose existence no one could verify in addition to trading tools. Martha had confronted the man after learning of this just a few weeks prior to her disappearance. He had pledged to settle the dispute, to divorce his wife, to move away, and to start over. However, they were falsehoods. There have always been lies. Sheriff Briggs telegrammed authorities in neighboring states with this new information. He gave a description of the man, mentioned his purported occupation, and requested that they look into the records of land merchants, street vendors, and anyone else who might fit that description. Even though there was little communication technology available at the time and it took days for responses to arrive, things gradually started to fit together. In Pike County, Kentucky, a sheriff answered the telegram. "I know a man who fits the description," he said. James Edward Callahan, a 38-year-old Cincinnati, Ohio native, was his true name. In the past, Callahan was under investigation for fraud involving the sale of fictitious properties. He sold fictitious land parcels, conned impoverished families, and vanished before they learned about the fraud. However, he had never faced formal charges. Every time, he managed to get away before the police could apprehend him. The telegram was accompanied by unsettling information from the Kentucky sheriff. A little over a month after Martha vanished in June, Callahan was last seen boarding a westbound train, possibly headed to Missouri or Kansas. He appeared to be in a hurry and was only carrying a small suitcase. Because Callahan had purchased a one-way ticket, a train station employee recalled him. Ticket, and had pressed for information on cities where he could go undetected. Now Briggs had a name, a history, and a purpose. However, the area was quite large. In 1914, it was easy to start a new life, change one's name, and reinvent oneself in the western United States without anyone questioning you. Every day, thousands of individuals did just that, escaping debt, troubled pasts, or crimes they had committed. It would be the equivalent of searching for a needle in half the country's worth of hay. However, the sheriff persisted. Police stations in Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, and even California received comprehensive descriptions of Callahan from it. It contained details about his prior frauds, Martha Pike's murder, and the pressing need to prosecute him. The months passed slowly. Appalachia is experiencing the arrival of autumn, which has painted the mountains in shades of gold and red. The paths where Martha had last walked were covered with fallen leaves, and as nature did its. The Pike family continued to live in an unending cycle without peace, justice, or answers. The unexpected news came in November, when the mountain streams were starting to freeze due to the first severe cold. From St. Louis, Missouri, a telegram. A man who was attempting to sell fraudulent land to recently arrived German immigrants was arrested by local authorities. The man first identified himself as John Miller during interrogation, but his fingerprints, when compared with records of prior arrests in other states, disclosed who he really was. James Edward Callahan was his name. The murderer of Martha Pike was finally apprehended following months of searching. However, returning Callahan to West Virginia would only be the start of a more challenging fight. See what transpired when he was ultimately held accountable for his crimes by continuing to read. It took almost 6 weeks to extradite James Edward Callahan from Missouri to West Virginia. The legal system at the time was cumbersome and slow, involving a mountain of paperwork that needed to be signed, stamped, and sent from one state to another. Judges from various jurisdictions, and attorneys who suddenly showed up offering representation. Callahan attempted to thwart extradition by arguing that he should be tried in Missouri first because that state had jurisdiction over the fraud crimes he had committed there. His attorneys contended that it was all a horrible lie and that he had never visited West Virginia. However, Sheriff Briggs had carried out his duties with care. He collected the accounts of witnesses who saw Callahan on the Pike property. Local traders who recalled selling him provisions signed statements for him. Abigail Thornton's testimony regarding Martha's pregnancy and the young woman's admissions regarding the father of the child was more significant. All the evidence pointed to Callahan. The pieces fit together in a way that is both dark and unavoidable. James Edward Callahan eventually reached Real in January 1915, 9 months after Martha's passing, escorted by 2 federal marshals while handcuffed. A crowd gathered outside the police station as soon as word of his arrival spread. Those faces were filled with anger. It hurt. Whole families had come to see the man who had taken Martha from this world, some of them making the long journey across the snowy mountains. With his eyes fixed on the door where Callahan would be taken, Martha's father, who appeared to have aged decades in a matter of months, stood silently. As Callahan emerged from the Shouts from the crowd erupted from the carriage that had taken him from the train station. While some people cried, others cried out for justice right away. Others restrained a man who attempted to approach the prisoner. In order to ensure that Callahan reached his cell alive, Sheriff Briggs had to create a human barrier with his deputies, not because she wanted to keep him safe, but because she understood that justice had to be served. Lynchings were common during that period, particularly in tiny towns with high levels of emotion and little tolerance for the legal system. Callahan did not live up to expectations. It wasn't a monster that stood out. He was an average height man with typical features that could have belonged to any merchant or traveler. But there was something cold, almost calculating, in his eyes. He maintained a nearly unconcerned face, despite being handcuffed and surrounded by people who wanted to see him dead, as though it were all a passing inconvenience. Those who saw the coldness were profoundly troubled. The man who could commit atrocities and then sleep soundly at night was the embodiment of banal evil. March was the date of the trial. Callahan was held in the county jail, a red brick structure at the rear of the police station with just 6 cells, for the duration of the 2-month wait. He rarely spoke to the guards, ate his meals in silence, and spent his days lying on his cell's small bed and gazing at the damp, discolored ceiling. When his attorney came to town, they spoke in low tones that were inaudible to others. The defense plan was being meticulously developed. In the meantime, Thomas Whitfield, a young attorney who served as the county's district attorney, put forth a lot of effort to strengthen the case against Callahan. Despite being only 30, Whitfield was well known for his commitment and his capacity to make compelling arguments in even the most difficult situations. He was aware that he lacked tangible proof. The murder had no eyewitnesses. No confession was made. What he possessed was an array of situations that, when combined, created an unavoidable image of guilt. Whitfield conducted dozens of interviews. He spent a lot of time with Abigail Thornton, getting her ready for her testimony. He had a conversation with the Garrett brothers, who had discovered the body. He discussed Martha's injuries and their implications for her death with Dr. Morton. Every little detail was recorded. Every claim was respected and confirmed. He was unable to provide Callahan with any escape routes. The whole city appeared to be in suspension in those winter months. The impending trial was always the topic of conversation in local businesses. Conjecture about what would transpire, whether Callahan would be found guilty, and what penalty would be suitable for such a horrible offense. West Virginia continued to use hanging as a method of execution. Additionally, a lot of people in the neighborhood thought that this was the only way to hold the man responsible for killing Martha Pike and the unborn child accountable. However, some people had doubts and whispered that there might not have been sufficient evidence, that a skilled attorney could raise legitimate concerns among the jurors that Callahan might somehow avoid the penalty he was due. The date of judgment drew closer and closer as winter gradually gave way to spring. The snow melted in the mountains, and the first green shoots appeared. These doubts kept everyone up at night, fearing that justice might fail again. James Edward Callahan's final confrontation between the truth and his lies was set to start. Follow us to learn what transpired in that courtroom and whether justice was ultimately served. The morning of March 15, 1915, was gray and chilly over Rail. A thick fog clung to the roofs of the small buildings that made up the city's center and shrouded the dirt streets. Never before had the county courthouse, a 2-story structure with tall windows and a groaning wooden staircase beneath it, drawn so much attention. People started to swarm outside in the wee hours of the morning, waiting for an opportunity to enter and see the trial that had been anticipated by all. On that particular day, over 150 people attempted to enter the courtroom, which could accommodate about 80 people seated. Only those with seats were allowed to stay, according to Justice Harold Peaton, a 62-year-old man with long gray hair and a reputation for severity. The others would have to wait outside while anyone who could hear through the open windows reported what had transpired inside. The front row was occupied by the Pike family. Martha's father, dressed in his one and only dark suit, sat rigidly as if he were trying to hide an inexplicable pain. Her mother had a white handkerchief by her side, which she twisted between her fingers all the time. Two boys, ages 17 and 19, who were Martha's younger siblings, stood by their parents as silent protectors. Their expressions conveyed a mix of repressed rage and brittle optimism that they would at last find closure. There was complete silence when James Edward Callahan entered the room. Fell on everyone in the room. His lawyer provided him with clean, basic clothes, and two deputies escorted him inside. During the trial, there were no visible handcuffs or chains, a choice that the defense lawyer had insisted would not have a detrimental effect on the jury. With deliberate steps, Callahan made his way to his chair, sat down, and glanced at the audience for a moment before focusing on the table before him. He was emotionless. 12 local men who were either farmers, merchants, or coal mine employees made up the jury. They were men who understood the importance of honor and the word given, as well as the struggles of Appalachian life. Men who had most likely met Martha Pike at some point in their lives. The defense counsel rejected anyone who acknowledged ever having an opinion on the case, so jury selection took a full day. Thomas Whitfield, the prosecutor, gave a thorough account of Martha Pike's last days to start his presentation. He talked about the young lady, her modest aspirations, and her straightforward, family farm life. Then, in a firm but emotionally restrained voice, he introduced the jury to James Edward Callahan, the traveling merchant who had enticed Martha with false promises, and then, when she became a liability that might damage his reputation and reveal his wrongdoings in other states, chose to have her removed. Whitfield called the first witness, Abigail Thornton. Leaning on a cane, the elderly midwife struggled to climb onto the dais. With a shaky but resolute voice, she reiterated all she had said to the sheriff. He described Martha's April visit, the young woman's anguish upon learning she was pregnant, how she had brought up the child's father, and her assurances that everything would be worked out. The woman was adamant when the defense lawyer attempted to undermine her testimony by implying that Abigail might be confusing Martha for another patient. She had a vivid memory of it. Her birth and consultation diaries contained notes. Next, the witnesses arrived who had observed Callahan in the springtime at the Pike estate. According to the testimony of a neighbor who lives near the main road, he witnessed the accused leaving the house at least 3 times at dusk. One of the town's merchants claimed to have sold tobacco to a man who fit Callahan's description. The man said he was passing through but was visiting a local acquaintance. An additional layer of circumstantial evidence was added with each testimony. The most significant moment occurred when one of the hunters, Thomas Garrett, discovered the body, was asked to provide testimony. He gave a startling account of what they had seen that August morning. He discussed the location's distance from any known trail and the obvious attempt to conceal the body beneath branches and stones. When he described the condition in which Martha was discovered, his voice trailed off, and a few audience members started to sob quietly. The medical findings of Dr. Henry Morton were presented. He gave the jury a straightforward explanation of the various forms of trauma Martha had experienced. He attested to that when she passed away, she was about 3 months pregnant. Based on the condition of the body when it was discovered, he calculated that the death had most likely taken place on the same day that he vanished. According to his analysis, Martha was transported to the scene of the attack while she was still alive. No mishap occurred. Defense was out of the question. It was a deliberate act of violence. The defense attorney attempted to raise questions. He maintained that no one had seen Callahan in person. With Martha, on the day of the disappearance, that the body had been discovered in circumstances that prevented a precise identification, and that there was no concrete proof that he was even in West Virginia at that specific time. He implied that everyone was just searching for an easy scapegoat from an outsider, and that the crime might have been committed by another man, possibly a member of his own community. But in the face of the mounting evidence, his words sounded hollow. The jury was able to see through the attempts to cause misunderstandings. They were able to make the connections that the prosecutor had meticulously laid out. And everyone knew that James Edward Callahan's fate was set when the trial's first day came to an end, and Judge Peaton slammed his gavel, declaring that they would resume the following morning. However, the trial's upcoming days would reveal even more sinister details about the man who had ruined so many lives. Don't miss this story's next chapter. Nobody expected the surprise that came on the second day of the trial. A woman nobody knew was among those who had been waiting outside the courthouse since the break of day. She had on a plain, dark dress and a hat that covered part of her face. His clothes were dusty and crumpled, as if he had traveled a great distance. She was among the first to enter when the doors opened and took a seat at the back of the room, out of sight. Thomas Whitfield began performing again by summoning the Day's sheriff, Walter Briggs. A stack of documents that Briggs had gathered during his investigation was brought with him. He told the jury about the months-long hunt for Martha, including the dead ends and red herrings. Subsequently, he displayed the telegrams that were sent to authorities in other states. Through these cables, James Edward Callahan's actual identity started to surface in an even more unsettling manner. Callahan was more than just a land scammer, the sheriff disclosed. He possessed a track record that spanned 7 states and at least 15 years. The pattern was the same everywhere. He would enter a small town, pose as an investor or merchant, win over the confidence of common people, and then vanish, leaving behind victims who were left with broken promises and financial ruin. However, something darker followed it on at least 3 prior occasions. A young woman named Sarah Brennan vanished in Tennessee in 1898 after being regularly spotted with a traveling businessman who fit Callahan's description. His body was never located. Elizabeth Warren, another young woman, vanished in Kentucky in 1940 under comparable circumstances. A man who sold land and tools had also courted her. Authorities had determined that she had fallen by accident when her body was discovered months later in a deep ravine. However, in light of the Martha Pike case, that conclusion now appeared to be gravely incorrect. As this information was presented, there was a whisper of horror in the courtroom. What was initially believed to be a lone murder committed out of despair and fear may actually be a part of a much larger pattern. In addition to Martha Pike's death, James Edward Callahan may have been involved in a number of other deaths over the years. A predator that traveled from one state to another, causing suffering and devastation along the way. The unidentified woman seated at the rear of the room rose at this precise moment. His shaky voice broke the stillness. "I am aware of his identity. I understand what he did." Everyone looked at her. After slamming his gavel for order, Judge Peaton permitted the woman to approach after noticing her emotional state. Reluctantly, she made her way to the front of the courthouse down the central aisle. The woman introduced herself as James Edward Callahan's wife, Margaret Callahan. As soon as she saw in the newspapers that her husband was being tried for murder, she left Cincinnati, Ohio, to travel. Margaret appeared much older than her 41 years of age. His countenance displayed the signs of years of silent pain. Even the toughest men in the room felt a pinch in their hearts as she told a story, tears streaming down her cheeks. Margaret disclosed that she married James 20 years ago when he was 18 and she was just 21. He initially gave the impression of being a driven and aspirational young man, but his true nature soon became apparent. He would go for months at a time, returning with tales of failed ventures and vows that things would be different the next time. Margaret found the lies, the scams, the betrayals. However, a married woman's options were limited at the time. No matter how much she suffered at the hands of her husband, society expected her to stick by him. She characterized James as a man devoid of morality, unable to experience regret or true compassion. He only considered others as means to an end. Margaret had made 2 attempts to leave him. He found her and brought her back on both occasions, but he never made the promised changes. She was always afraid, not just of him, but also of what he was capable of. She also started to suspect the unimaginable when she started reading in the newspapers about young women going missing on the routes her husband took. Margaret's testimony was immediately contested by the defense lawyer, who claimed that she was a biased witness and an enraged wife seeking retribution for a failed marriage. However, Whitfield, the prosecutor, contended that his testimony was pertinent to determining the accused's personality and predatory behavior pattern. She was permitted to continue by Judge Payton, but cautioned the jury to take her statements into account in the appropriate context. Then, Margaret disclosed something that would fundamentally alter the trial's outcome. She claimed that during her travels over the years, she saved letters that James had written to her. He occasionally mentioned the people and places he visited in these letters. Additionally, he mentioned a young woman on a farm who was expressing romantic interest in him in a letter dated April 1914, sent from somewhere in West Virginia. The tone of his writing was one of cruel mockery, that the young lady was easily manipulated and naive. This letter had been brought by Margaret. Her hands shaking, she gave it to the prosecutor. The court heard Whitfield read it out loud. Written in his own handwriting, Callahan's words attested to his presence in West Virginia at the precise time in question. They verified his connection to a young lady who fit Martha's description. The letter's harsh and disdainful tone also made clear how he really felt. Martha had not experienced love. It had been a success, a hobby, something to be thrown away when it became inconvenient. That moment had a devastating effect. James Edward Callahan reacted visibly for the first time since the trial began. His face went white, and he stared at his wife with a look of anger mixed with what might be called fear. He said something in a whisper to his attorney, who promptly requested a break so he could speak with his client. The judge gave them 15 minutes. While on break, the hum within it was deafening outside the courtroom. Margaret Callahan stayed seated in the witness area, receiving consolation from a few local women who came over to offer assistance. Even though she knew she was cheating on the man she had married, she had traveled across the nation to do it because she believed it was the right thing to do. Everyone in attendance was profoundly moved by the woman's bravery in revealing her own husband's wrongdoings. Everyone was aware that James Edward Callahan's fate was certain when the trial resumed, firmly sealed. However, the drama had not yet ended. Follow along to see how this sinister tale turns out. The mood in the room had completely changed by the time the trial resumed following recess. Once based on indirect testimony and circumstantial evidence, the accusation had now become unavoidable. The missing direct link was the letter from Callahan. Tangible evidence that he was in the area at the precise time of Martha Pike's death and that he knew her. Disappearance, and that he had a contemptuous and manipulative attitude toward her. Richard Hastings, the defense lawyer who had traveled from Charleston specifically for this case, was aware that his plan had failed. He made one final, desperate move. In an attempt to undermine Margaret Callahan's motivation for testifying, he requested to cross-examine her. He implied that she may have even falsified or changed the contents of that letter, which she had held on to for all those years, waiting for a chance to hurt her husband. However, Margaret remained steadfast. He was painfully honest in his responses to each question, acknowledging that while there was hurt and resentment, doing the right thing came first. Then, Prosecutor Whitfield took an unexpected action. He requested permission from the judge to call a witness who wasn't on the initial list. As soon as he heard about the trial, a police officer from Knoxville, Tennessee, made the trip to Rio. Files were brought by the officer, Daniel McCarthy, a man in his mid-50s, on Sarah Brennan's 1898 disappearance. According to McCarthy's testimony, he was never able to close that case. Witnesses claimed to have seen Sarah with a traveling merchant in the weeks prior, but she had vanished without a trace. He had created sketches based on the descriptions at the time. He brought those old drawings from 17 years ago to the court. There was no denying the resemblance to James Edward Callahan. The identical facial features, facial structure, and even the form of thee. His previous beard complemented the designs. Additionally, the officer disclosed that Sarah Brennan was expecting a child at the time of her disappearance. He had learned about it from the midwife who had cared for her, but his family had concealed it out of embarrassment. The pattern was the same as in Martha Pike's case. Young people who are vulnerable are seduced by promises, impregnated, and then removed when they start to cause problems. Callahan hadn't killed once in a panic attack. His methodical killings had been consistent with the same macabre script. The defense vehemently objected, claiming that Martha Pike was the focus of the trial and not previous cases from other states. Judge Peaton, however, permitted testimony, stating that he had established a pertinent pattern of behavior to ascertain the accused's guilt. It was evident that the jury was shaken. There were jurors who gazed at Callahan with barely disguised disgust. Some just kept their eyes downcast as though it was too much to bear to see that evil up close. When it came time for closing remarks, Thomas Whitfield. He got up and moved slowly until he was in front of the jury. He didn't need to be eloquent or dramatic. The facts were self-evident. Over the course of the 2-day trial, he methodically summarized every piece of evidence that was presented. Callahan's presence in the region, his relationship with Martha, the letter he had written himself, his wife's testimony, the pattern of behavior that stretched for almost 2 decades. Then, Whitfield did something nobody saw coming. He requested a brief period of quiet in remembrance of Pike, Martha. For 60 long seconds, the courtroom was completely silent. Everyone was able to think about the child who would never be born, about dreams that would never come true, about the family that would never fully recover from that loss, and about the young life that had been cruelly interrupted in that silence. Whitfield's voice carried the weight of his moral responsibility when he finally broke the silence. He addressed the jurors directly, stating that they held not only the duty to bring Martha Pike justice, while simultaneously making it abundantly evident that men like James Edward Callahan could not go around the nation taking lives without consequence. The belief that all American young women should be free from predators who take advantage of human weakness, that a just society was kept apart from chaos and barbarism by the law, despite its flaws. Defense attorney Richard Hastings made his closing statement with noticeably less conviction than he had shown at the start of the trial. He appealed to the concept of the presumption of innocence, reminded the jury that convictions should be based on absolute certainty and not on probabilities or suggestive patterns. He argued that there was sufficient reasonable doubt to acquit his client, but his words rang hollow even to his own ears. He was doing his professional duty, but it was clear that even he no longer believed in the innocence of the man he represented. Judge Peaton then gave his instructions to the jury. He explained the nuances of the law, the requirements for a conviction for first-degree murder, the difference between circumstantial evidence and direct evidence. He reminded them that their decision should be unanimous, and that they should deliberate seriously and carefully. Then, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon of the 16th day of March, 1915, the jury retired to the deliberation room. The wait was agonizing. The families remained in court, unable to leave without knowing the outcome. Margaret Callahan continued to sit alone, in a corner, lost in thoughts no one could have imagined. Sheriff Briggs stood guard at the door of the deliberation room, preventing any attempt to influence the jurors. Hours passed. The sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the streets of Rio. It was almost 7 o'clock in the evening when the door to the deliberation room finally opened. The jury had reached a verdict. Judge Peaton ordered everyone to return to their seats. The silence that fell over that room was absolute. Even the sound of breathing seemed too loud. The foreman of the jury, a middle-aged farmer named William Foster, stood up holding a piece of paper in his trembling hands. And when he began to read the verdict, James Edward Callahan's fate was finally sealed. But what happened next would shock even those who thought they had seen it all. Don't miss the next part. William Foster's voice was firm, but it carried the weight of a decision that would change lives forever. We, the jury, found defendant James Edward Callahan guilty of first-degree murder. A collective sigh ran through the room. Some people began to cry. Others closed their eyes in silent relief. Martha Pike's father lowered his head and covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs that he had suppressed for entire days. James Edward Callahan remained motionless in his chair. There was no surprise on his face, no despair, no regret, just that same cold, distant expression he had maintained for almost the entire trial. It was as if he was watching something that happened to someone else, as if that verdict had nothing to do with him. This absence of emotion was, in some ways, more disturbing than any outburst of anger or denial could have been. Judge Peaton slammed his gavel repeatedly to restore order, as emotion threatened to overflow in those present. When he finally got enough silence, he thanked the jury for their service and set sentencing for the next morning. The law required that there be an interval between the verdict and the determination of the punishment, a last moment for all parties to present arguments about what penalty would be appropriate. But everyone in that room knew what the outcome would be for first-degree murder in West Virginia. Especially a case with such aggravating circumstances, there was only one possible sentence. That night, Rio experienced moments of collective catharsis. Groups formed in the streets, in houses, in establishments that remained open until late. There were tears, there were hugs, there were conversations about justice and about how that verdict would not bring Martha back, but at least give some meaning to her death. Dozens of people came to show support and condolences to the Pike family. After remaining silent and stoic during the trial, Martha's mother finally let her grief show in full, sobbing in the arms of the women in the community who were gathered around her. That night, Margaret Callahan stayed by herself in a small boarding house room that she had rented. She had done what needed to be done, but the emotional toll was devastating. She had just testified against her own husband. She had provided the evidence that would probably lead him to the gallows. There was no way for me to return to my former life in Cincinnati. Everything had changed irreversibly. She wondered how her life had reached that stage as she stayed up until dawn, gazing out the window at the shadowy mountains. The court reconvened for sentencing the following morning, March 17th. Judge Peaton permitted the prosecution and defense will conclude by discussing the proper punishment. Thomas Whitfield maintained that the maximum punishment was warranted due to the premeditated nature of the offense, and the years-long pattern of predatory behavior. He reminded the court that Callahan had killed both Martha Pike and the unborn child she was carrying. For the price of one murder, two are committed. The defense lawyer, in grim but accurate terms, made a final appeal for clemency, contending that the death penalty was cruel and that even convicted men should be given the chance to turn their lives around by serving a life sentence. But his remarks were not well received. Following a brief period of introspection, Judge Peyton delivered the sentence in a clear and solemn voice. James Edward Callahan would be hanged to death. A little more than 2 months in the future, on May 22, 1915, the date was decided. The sentence quickly became known, not just through Real but also throughout the West Virginia's southern region. The case took up whole pages in local newspapers. In an editorial titled "Justice Delayed but Necessary," the Greenbrier Independent discussed how the legal system had finally functioned in spite of its flaws and tardiness. The story was also covered by other newspapers in nearby states, particularly in Tennessee and Kentucky, where the families of other young women who went missing were finally given some information about what had probably happened to their daughters. For the following 2 months, James Edward Callahan waited for his execution in the county jail. He occasionally had visitors, particularly his attorney, who was still looking for a way to challenge the sentence, but there wasn't much he could do. The evidence had been overwhelming. There were no technical reasons to overturn the decision because the trial had been conducted correctly. During that time, Margaret Callahan made just one trip to see her husband. She required explanations. I had to speak with him directly to find out if there were any other victims in addition to their existing acquaintances. Callahan declined to speak with her despite the fact that other families were going through hardships without knowing what would happen to their daughters. He merely turned his face and requested that they return her to the cell when she entered the visiting area. He would keep his secrets until the very end. Even if the knowledge was painful, I would never, ever give families the peace that came from knowing. Tension in Real grew as the execution date drew near. Executions in public were still frequent at the time, and there was discussion about whether it should be conducted more discreetly or publicly. Judge Peyton decided that only official witnesses and Martha Pike's family members, if they so chose, would be allowed to attend the restricted execution. He didn't want it to become a macabre show. Now that justice had been served, it had to be administered with the respect that the circumstances required. In the courtyard behind the jail, the gallows was set up. It was a basic wooden structure designed with that in mind. The executioner would be a seasoned man from Charleston who had carried out previous executions in the state. Everything was being carefully prepared to guarantee that the execution would be quick and, to the greatest extent feasible given the circumstances, humanitarian. Sheriff Briggs made it clear that it was about the law doing what it was supposed to do, not about retaliation. A storm was building over Appalachia the night before the execution. There was thunder reverberating between the mountains resemble far-off drums. The wooded hillsides were momentarily illuminated by lightning, revealing the scene of so much suffering. Real's streets were being washed by the torrential rain, which was also overflowing the streams. It seemed as though the natural world was honoring Martha Pike and all of James Edward Callahan's victims in a final way. And everyone realized that the sinister tale that had started over a year ago was about to come to an end when dawn finally arrived on May 22nd. One final twist, however, was still to come. Stay with us until the very end. The morning of May 22nd came with a heavy fog that would not go away. The streets were covered in mud from the previous night's storm, and the air was thick with moisture that clung to people's skin like an unseen cloak. A small group started to congregate in the jail yard at 6 in the morning. Sheriff Briggs, Judge Peyton, District Attorney Thomas Whitfield, and Father Michael O'Connor, a local priest who had been asked to deliver the final. Wrights, the Charleston executioner, 2 deputies, and 3 county-appointed official witnesses. The father of Martha Pike was also present. For weeks, he had been debating whether or not to go. His wife had pleaded with him not to go, stating that he would not find peace if he saw the execution, only more unsettling pictures to live with for the rest of his life. But he thought he ought to be there. As a father and protector who had failed to keep his daughter safe, it was his responsibility to make sure that justice was fully served. He was there wearing his dark suit, his hair completely grayed over the past year, and his face marred by sleepless nights. At 7 o'clock, James Edward Callahan was taken out of his cell. They had offered him breakfast, but he had declined. Additionally, he had declined the priest's presence, claiming that he didn't require spiritual consolation or absolution. As he had done for months, he lay on his narrow bed and stared at his cell's ceiling during his final hours in silence. He got up when the deputies arrived to collect him, without opposition, and moved among them while maintaining the same aloof demeanor that he had kept throughout the trial. Callahan hesitated a moment when he emerged into the courtyard and saw the gallows set up before him. His face showed signs of emotion for the first and only time. It wasn't precisely fear. It was more akin to accepting the inevitable and acknowledging it. He breathed deeply in the muggy morning air, gazed up at the gray sky, and then proceeded toward the wooden stairs leading to the platform of the gallows. The executioner, a stout man in his 40s whose name was never formally listed in county records, made one final check of his ropes and mechanisms. Everything was prepared in accordance with the then current protocols. The fall would be timed to be as quick as possible to minimize pain. They were searching for resolution, not cruelty. Father O'Connor stood close to the gallows, whispering prayers in a low voice, even after Callahan rejected him. Voice. He prayed for everyone in attendance who would have to live with the memory of that moment for the rest of their lives, in addition to the souls of the condemned. At that moment, an entirely unexpected event occurred. Everyone assumed Callahan would keep quiet as he had done all along, when Sheriff Briggs asked if he had any final remarks. However, James Edward Callahan made the decision to speak up for the first time since his arrest. His tone was relaxed, almost informal, as though he were making a kind comment about the day or the weather. He claimed that since he had no regrets, he would not beg for forgiveness. He believed that Martha Pike was just one of many, and that she would repeat the experience if given the chance. He didn't see why using people as tools or means to an end was wrong. He described how he had prepared every date, every seduction, and every discard when women became inconvenient. Then he said something that chilled the blood of everyone in the room, with a barely noticeable smile on his lips. There were far more victims than anyone could have guessed, he said. Martha might have been the 12th, but she wasn't the 3rd or the 4th. That bodies were concealed in forests and ravines in at least 10 different states. Some of the women had simply vanished into thin air, buried somewhere they would never be discovered, and he would take the precise location of each one's grave, depriving the families of even the chance to bury their daughters in a dignified manner. That last confession was an unconscionable horror. Martha Pike's father moved forward, seemingly heading for the gallows, but the deputies held him back. As he yelled questions that Callahan would not answer, tears ran down his cheeks. The bodies were missing. Which names were they? How could it be so heinous as to deny broken families even this final comfort? However, Callahan just turned his head and signaled his readiness to the executioner. The rope was adjusted around his neck, and the black hood was put over his head. Father O'Connor's voice quivered with the emotion of the moment as he stepped up his prayers. The lever that would open the trap door was touched by the executioner. And James Edward Callahan paid the price for his crimes with his life on May 22, 1915, at 7 o'clock and 23 minutes in the morning. It was a quick fall. Through the quiet, the trapdoor's opening sound reverberated. Courtyard. There was a dry crack as the rope stretched. After waiting the required number of minutes, the attending physician went up to make sure there was no pulse. At 7 hours and 27 minutes, he was declared dead. For everyone who saw it, the 4 minutes seemed to go on forever. According to protocol, the body was left hanging for 30 minutes before being lowered and made ready for burial. Far from the graves of dignified people, James Edward Callahan was laid to rest in an unmarked grave in a remote area of the county cemetery. There wasn't ceremony. There was only a grave dug in the wet ground and a body placed in it like trash being thrown away. There was no mourning. For a man who had treated human lives with the same disdain, it was a fitting conclusion. However, the wounds left by his last confession would never fully heal. Authorities in several states made an effort to look into his claims in the months and years that followed. In order to find unresolved cases of missing women that might relate to Callahan's time in their areas, they looked through old records. They discovered a minimum of 7 instances that appeared to follow the pattern. However, they could never be certain without specific confessions and the body's location. During those years, families who had lost daughters under mysterious circumstances had to live with the awful uncertainty of never knowing whether their loved ones had died at the hands of Callahan or had met a different but no less terrible end. The anguish of the confirmed loss was somewhat less severe than this uncertainty. It was an injury that would never heal, completely comprehended. Dark Appalachian folklore now includes the tale of Martha Pike and James Edward Callahan. It was a warning about the perils of the remote roads and how evil could use a common face to hide terrible intentions. It was told on chilly nights by fireplaces. Even though Martha had received justice, Callahan's shadows were too long, too dark, and extended well beyond that Mayday and real. Stay tuned for this unsettling story's conclusion. The Appalachian region of West Virginia saw gradual but substantial change in the years after James Edward Callahan's execution. The tale of Martha Pike will always be remembered. It was incorporated into the collective memory of the community, a lasting mark on that location's consciousness. Strangers who showed up with seductive promises made young women more suspicious. Families started to become more guarded, and a somber realization of the vulnerability in those remote routes between the mountains began to emerge. It was never entirely recovered by the Pike family. After the execution, Martha's father lived for just 7 more years. According to those who knew him, he died of a broken heart, gradually losing his will to live due to the anguish of losing his daughter in that manner. He worked quietly on the farm in his final years, rarely discussing Martha, but everyone knew that she was on his mind constantly. In the tiny cemetery of the neighborhood church, he was laid to rest beside his daughter, a meeting that death had denied him during his lifetime. The mother of Martha lived almost 20 years longer than her husband. She became a nearly spectral presence in the neighborhood, a woman who had been devastated by an unfathomable tragedy but had persevered through sheer willpower. Every week, she brought wild flowers she picked from the same slopes Martha had walked on as a child to her daughter's grave. During these visits, she reportedly spoke to her daughter about the week's events and how the world continued to turn even though it seemed impossible for her. So as to do. The 2 young men who had stood by their parents during the trial, Martha's siblings, carried the burden of that loss throughout their childhood. Years later, the oldest became deputy county sheriff, claiming he wanted to ensure that no other family experienced what his had. Unable to stay in a place where every hill and trail made him think of his sister, who had never come home, the younger moved west. He never went back to West Virginia, though occasionally letters did arrive. Margaret. Shortly after the execution, Callahan, the woman who had the guts to testify against her own husband, vanished from the annals of history. According to some, she had moved back to Cincinnati under a different identity in an attempt to start over away from the scandal surrounding Callahan's crimes. Others thought she had relocated to the West, possibly to California, in search of anonymity in areas where her past was unknown. Confirmation never came. Margaret merely vanished into the American wilderness, turning into another spectral presence in a Ghosts are already present in the story. Before retiring, Sheriff Walter Briggs served the county for an additional 15 years. He would never forget the Martha Pike case. He frequently described it as the most unsettling case of his career in subsequent interviews with local newspapers. Not only was the crime brutal, but it also turned out that Callahan may have harmed a great number of other women. Briggs looked into old cases and tried to make connections for years. However, he was never able to fully shut those. Injuries caused by Callahan's most recent admission. Every testimony, piece of evidence, and moment of those dramatic days in March 1915 were documented in the trial files, which were kept in the Greenbrier County records. The pages were yellowed by time and had the meticulous handwriting of the clerks of that era. Every now and then, historians and researchers go to those archives and look through documents that date back hundreds of years in an effort to comprehend not just what happened, but also how it influenced the area and the community. Where Martha's body was found, was discovered, that isolated spot on Mount Sue's slopes was never the same. Hikers and hunters stayed away. It was said that there was a sense of melancholy in the air there, permeating even the stones and trees. Any tangible remnants of what had occurred there were eventually obscured by the forest's total reclaim of that area. However, the tales continued. Some claimed to have heard odd noises as they went by. Others mentioned feeling like they were being watched. They were most likely merely the ploys of suggestible minds. Play when they are aware of a location's troubled past. Or perhaps not. In his final remarks, Callahan referred to the other victims, who remained unsolved and plagued investigators and their families for decades. He had mentioned 12 women. Martha was one of just 12. Who were the others, though? Where were their bodies lying? What deep gorges? In which thick forests? Where had they been left, forgotten? There have never been any answers to these questions. Even in the final moments, Callahan denied these secrets, taking them with him to his grave. Any kind of atonement or sympathy. There were attempts to identify potential victims in the years that followed. In Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio, Missouri, Kansas, and other states where Callahan was known to have been, missing women's records were examined. Some families have come to the bitter conclusion that Callahan's presence in the area during that time was related to the disappearance of their daughters. However, many others persisted in their awful hesitancy, never being certain if their loved ones had come into contact with that predator. The tale of Martha Pike has come to represent something greater. It symbolized the vulnerability of young women during a period when there were few legal protections. Traveling alone was risky, and predatory men could move freely between states without effective tracking systems or official communication. Change came gradually as a result of the case. Systems for identification started to get better. Interaction between police divisions has increased in frequency across various states, and a growing consciousness of serial crimes started to emerge. Martha Pike's story is still a troubling reminder over a century after those terrible events. Deep valleys, thick forests, and mist-covered mountains still exist in the Appalachian Mountains. Little has changed in the landscape. But everyone who knew Martha saw the trial and was there on that chilly May morning when justice was served is no longer there. The living were lost to time. Witnesses, but it left behind the documents, the tales, and the painful lessons about the nature of evil and the value of justice. The grave of Martha Pike remains in Real's tiny church cemetery. Decades later, a more resilient tombstone took the place of the original, plain, unassuming one. Sometimes, flowers left by distant descendants or by tourists who heard the story and felt compelled to honor a life so cruelly disrupted still show up there. It is a serene location, of contemplation, where the burden of history is felt. The macabre tale of 23-year-old Martha Pike, whose hopes for a straightforward and contented life have been dashed in the shadow of Appalachia, comes to an end. His memory endures not as a helpless victim, but as a reminder of all the people killed by violence, all the families torn apart by tragedy, and all the unsolved mysteries in the shadowy past. May his tale serve as a reminder to us to always be on guard, to shield the weak, and to never undervalue people's ability to be evil and their bravery in facing it. We sincerely appreciate your participation in this dark journey through one of the most unsettling cases in Appalachian history, if you have made it this far. Tell us what you think of this story by leaving a comment. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our historical investigations, and subscribe to the channel for more cases similar to this one. Until the next tale.